close.
Thanks, Mr Acting Deputy President. I remember when the Murray-Darling Basin Plan was finalised around about a decade ago, and there was such hope. We'd had the millennium drought. It was clear that the river system was in such dire straits. It was absolutely on its knees. It was such a political, hard-fought, such a fraught issue. And I remember the negotiations and finally coming down and the agreement that there would be environmental flows on average of 3,200 gigalitres a year allocated to the river. I remember that that in itself was a compromise, that the scientists, the people who knew the river so well, they absolutely felt that more was required. But that 3,200 was the compromise, and everybody felt, well, maybe if we get the 3,200, it'll just be enough. It'll just be enough to keep this river system healthy, this lifeblood of half of Australia healthy. That was the context. In the decade since, fortunately, the drought broke. Good. And it seems that the pressure has gone off and that there's a sense of, well, maybe that 3,200 wasn't really as essential as it was painted to be back then when the plan was finalised. And then, of course, we've had the political context, the layer over that Murray-Darling Basin Plan, which has been added over the last decade, and particularly what has come to light over the last year: the water theft, the fraud, the appalling rorting of the whole plan, essentially, because of that fraud and that water theft by the corporate irrigators in the upstream reaches of the basin. It puts the whole basin plan into a different perspective. And then you've got that 3,200, but then it's clear that for quite a lot of people, quite a lot of players involved in this, they were never serious about 3,200 gigalitres. We had the 450 megalitres that was obviously seemed to be, an optional extra that has never had a strong commitment to it. There has been the pressure for that not to be delivered. And then we have got these sustainable diversion limits and this sustainable diversion limit adjustment mechanism of actually then taking out yet another huge chunk of that 3,200 gigalitres, which, remember, as I said, was at the beginning of the plan acknowledged as being the absolute minimum that was required for the river to stay healthy. I want to move from that context, from that political context, from that bureaucratic context, from talking about megalitres to talk about what this means to the river. My colleague Senator Hanson-Young speaks so eloquently and so passionately about the impacts of this basin plan on the river in South Australia. As a Victorian senator, I have a particular passion for the Murray as in its Victorian reaches, and particularly the river system and the river red gum forests of Victoria. I took the opportunity recently to go and visit some of the remaining river red gum forests in Victoria near Swan Hill, the Naya vinifera forests. This area of forest is actually, it's pretty small. If you think about the massive extent of river red gum forests that were all along the river at the time of white settlement. We've got these remnants, and the Naya vinifera forest is a remnant. It's only 820 hectares, but it is such a much-loved and so valuable remnant of the much larger river red gum forests that were once there. It is incredibly valued by the local community. And because it's a remnant, it is so much more, even more important for its ecological value and for what was once there. On this trip, which was organised for me by a couple of local activists, and I want to pay tribute to them in this speech, Jackie Kelly and Morgana Russell in particular, who were determined that they wanted me to visit the forest with them so that we could see together what the state of that forest was. And we met a local an orchardist, a local farmer, an irrigator, Peter Thornton, who was as passionate as Jackie and Morgana are about the health of the river. And she was outraged that that her name as an irrigation farmer was being used to justify reducing the level of water that was going into the river, because she knew that the health of her business, the health of her community, depended upon the health of the river. And she knew that without enough water going down the river, that her business was going to suffer, the community was going to suffer, as well as the life of the river. And then I also had the great privilege of meeting some of the traditional owners, some from the Wadi Wadi and Wamba Wamba people, and in particular a traditional owner, Kane Chaplin, who spent an afternoon with us as we walked the forest. It was such a privilege to walk this area of forest with Kane, to be there and to see his love for the forest, his connection for the forest, and also to feel his pain at how unhealthy that forest is, how stressed it is. This river red gum forest, it needs to be inundated every few years. It's because of the efforts of the local communities and because of massive campaigns, it's now being protected from logging. It's been protected as a regional park, and there was, great hope when that occurred that this forest was, had a chance to be brought back to a healthy situation. But sadly, even over the last decade, even though the drought is broken, even though we haven't had those dreadful conditions of the Millennium Drought, this area of forest is under stress. It is not getting the water it requires. It needs to be inundated every couple of years. It's not happening. And every large tree that we looked at, Kane and Jackie and Morgana said to me, have a look up there, and you could see the dead branches. You could see these trees were under stress. And we could think about what the future was going to be like for these forests. You could see dead trees. You knew that more and more of these trees were going to die because they were not getting the inundation they required. This was exactly the sort of issue that the Murray-Darling Basin Plan was meant to resolve, to make sure that these areas of river red gum forests were healthy. It's not yet working. And what are they planning on doing? Reducing the level of water that's going to be available to this forest. These sustainable diversion limit adjustment mechanism that's being proposed, that we are debating tonight, are actually going to mean there is less water available for this area of forest than is currently the case. And in fact, even if these projects worked, even if every one of them was actually effective at watering the forest, they're only going to cover approximately 60% of the forest in the Naya vinifera area. Only 60%. Leaving 40% aside, you're basically going to be meaning that 40% of the forest is going to just be dying a very sad, tragic death. And that's presuming that these sustainable diversion limit adjustment mechanisms actually work. And that is something that is absolutely very, very questionable, because nobody yet knows the details of what the sustainable diversion limit adjustment mechanisms are in these forests. Basically, the local community, the local traditional owners, the local environmentalists, they aren't yet able to be... the details of what the adjustment mechanisms are is not yet public. And as Senator Patrick has just said, they haven't yet, got business cases for them. They can't tell them what they are. What they are told is basically you're going to have a series of levies, of locks, of weirs that are going to mean that rather than having water flowing into these forests and then flowing out again, it's going to stop that water. And the theory is that instead of wasting this water, so-called wasting this water and having it flowing through, that just inundating this area of forest and having the water sit there for various periods of time, that is going to be the same as allowing the water to flow through. This is absolutely questionable, more than questionable. In fact, it is highly, highly unlikely that this is going to do the same, be the equivalent of having a natural flood flowing through that forest. And what's more, whereas you've now got an area of forest that is pretty much in its natural state, despite the stress that it's under, an area of forest that's beloved by people from all over Victoria who come and camp there regularly to be there in that forest, you're going to have levee banks, you're going to have locks, you're going to have these massive, great concrete structures to hold this water in place. And the likelihood of those adjustment mechanisms, these actual constructions meeting the needs of the forest is so small. I can just see that we're going to be spending the hundreds and thousands or the millions of dollars on these projects, and then in 10 years' time finding, oh, actually they're not working. That actually we're getting black water events because we're having this water sitting stagnant rather than flowing through. And that actually it's not serving the purposes that it's set out to do. But it'll be too late then. And it'll be too late then for the health of the river. And that is the issue, that is sort of the focal point of what we are discussing tonight. And I hear, Labor saying that, the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is back on track. That is a ridiculous assertion. How on earth can you say that the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is back on track when there is still so much that's unknown, and that we are going to be spending $1.3 billion in these untested adjustment mechanisms? That's right. Cutting out 605 billion litres of water. We haven't got, Senator Gallagher talking about improved transparency, where we're being asked to sign off on $1.3 billion worth of projects without having business places, without knowing that they're going to work. It is just something that is totally unacceptable, and something that, for me, concerned about the river, for us as Greens concerned about the health of this river, the health of these communities, we just absolutely cannot acquiesce to. So, the other aspect I think that we need to be talking about, going back to my point of that 3,200 gigalitres being an absolute minimum, and absolutely necessary that we get all of that, every single gigalitre of that water is needed for the health of the river, is what the Murray-Darling Basin Plan actually doesn't even consider. The fact that that allocation of water, when it was worked out a decade ago, didn't take into account the impact of climate change. You look at what's going to happen to flows in the basin with a warming climate, and we're going to need a lot more water being allocated for the environment if we're going to keep it healthy than what is being proposed. Where I was a month ago in Swan Hill, under scenarios of 3 to 4 degrees of warming, the climate of Swan Hill is likely to become like the climate of Cobar. This is the sorts of impacts that we are talking about with climate change, and yet we are talking about taking water out of the river. It is just completely unscientific. It is completely irrational. It will just mean that the river will just be being left to being a dying, sad vestige of its former health. The river, under the plan as proposed, under the Sustainable Diversion Limit Adjustment Mechanism, is being sold out. The river needs more water, not less. And for we in this parliament who are concerned about the health of the river, who are concerned about the livelihoods of the people who rely on the river, who are concerned about the livelihoods of the irrigators, who are concerned about the livelihoods of the community, who are concerned about the areas like the Nio-vinifera forest, a cultural landscape of immense significance to the traditional owners, we cannot agree for these Sustainable Diversion Limit Adjustment Mechanisms to be passed.